I'm the Vice President for Programs and Development here at the Center for Applied Linguistics. I'll be serving as your moderator today. I'm excited to facilitate what promises to be a visionary, forward-looking conversation about multilingual students' language and identity practices in the classroom and beyond. I'm honored to be joined today by 4 esteemed experts in the field, and I'd like to begin by introducing Dr. Bonnie Norton. Dr. Norton is University Killam Professor and a Distinguished University Scholar at the University of British Columbia. Her primary research interests are identity and language learning, digital storytelling, and international development. Her work has been translated into Chinese, French, German, Korean, Japanese, and Portuguese. She's a fellow of the Royal Society of Canada and the American Educational Research Association, and she was awarded 2020 British Columbia Academic of the Year for her leadership of the Global Storybooks Project. Next, I'd like to introduce Deborah Palmer. Dr. Deborah Palmer is Professor of Equity, Bilingualism, and Biliteracy at the School of Education at the University of Colorado Boulder. Her interests include bilingual education policy implementation, critical consciousness and dual language bilingual education, teacher leadership and preparation for linguistically and culturally diverse teaching, and language power and identity. Her 2018 book, Bilingual Teacher Leadership for Social Change, explores and defines teacher agency, activism, and leadership for bilingual educators. And she is co-editor of 2 forthcoming volumes, Critical Consciousness in DLBE, Case Studies on Policy and Practice, and Gentrification and Bilingual Education at Texas 2A Bilingual Education School across 7 years. I am delighted to introduce Dr. Sam Steen. Dr. Steen is Associate Professor and a licensed school counselor who specializes in group counseling research and cultivating Black students' academic identity development. Dr. Steen is currently a principal investigator for a National Science Foundation project entitled Developing a Framework for Action to Promote Black Males' Access to Algebra 1 by the 8th grade. Dr. Steen was a school counselor for 10 years and has written numerous peer-reviewed publications and several books, including Anti-Black Racism in Contemporary America and Introduction to Group Counseling, a culturally sustaining and inclusive framework. Finally, it is my great pleasure to introduce to you Andrea Sturzuk. Dr. Sturzuk is Professor of Language and Literacy Education at the University of Regina in Saskatchewan. Her research is in critical applied linguistics, examining issues of power, identity, and language in education. Her research projects have explored language variation in elementary schools, English-only ideology in higher education, language planning and policy in higher education, and the development of language beliefs in pre-service teachers. Professor Sturzuk has been the president of the Canadian Association of Applied Linguistics and has held many leadership roles in her university. She is also currently a member of the Center for Applied Linguistics Board of Trustees. Welcome to all 4 of our speakers, and welcome to all of you, our participants on this call. Thank you for joining us today to talk about this important topic. Our format today is a panel discussion, and so we're going to engage in a nice informal back and forth discussion with our experts here. So our title is Power, Identity, and Language. And I want to start us off with the last 2, the identity and the language piece together, right? So we often talk about language being socially situated, and I want to take a little bit at the beginning here for us to think about what does that mean exactly? How do individuals create their own social identities using language? And I want to turn it to you, Bonnie, first of all, just to give us a big picture overview of what that means from your research and your work.
Well, thank you very much for this opportunity, Kira. And of course, what a privilege it is to be here. I'm speaking to you from the unceded, ancestral, and traditional lands of the Musqueam people, and feel very proud and privileged to be here. it's quite a question looking at trying to summarize some of the key points in relation to language and identity. So I'm going to just speak to 3 issues that I think are particularly important, especially since we are in, of course, a Center for Applied Linguistics. One of the things we've come to understand is that language is not only a linguistic system, it is also a social practice and connects people in very important ways to one another. What I've argued is that every time people speak, they are not only exchanging information with one another, but they are organizing and reorganizing a sense of themselves and how they relate to the social world. So what we see is that identity is co-constructed in relationships. The second point concerns power, because what happens when there are unequal relations of power between people? Bourdieu has made the point that when people speak, can they command the attention of listeners? And this is a very key issue when it comes to categorizations of sexuality, race, gender, class, religion. How do these impact people's ability not only to speak, but to command the attention of listeners? The third point relates to investment, because we ask ourselves the question, what is the speaker's investment in the particular interaction? If there's unequal power, are people silenced in interaction? And certainly this does take place. But also if people are invested in the relationships and that they are engaging with and their hopes for the future, you may find that people will resist being silenced, that they will claim a space within a conversation, that they will also reframe their relationships with others in order to claim the right to speak. And this speaks to the issue of human agency. So when you're talking about language and identity, human agency is always central. So those are the 3 points that I hope will be of value to this discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Bonnie. Deb, I'd like to ask you to kind of add on to Bonnie's big picture piece there and talk to us a little bit about language and identity for multilingual students, and particularly for those multilingual students who work not only across 2 languages, but work with those 2 languages enmeshed together in what's often been called translanguaging practices.
Yeah, thank you, Kira. Thank you very much for the opportunity to be here. First of all, I'm really honored to be on this panel with colleagues who I've admired for a long time. And I also want to acknowledge that I'm talking to you all from the lands of the Cheyenne, Ute, and Arapaho peoples, which the settlers now call Boulder, Colorado. Building on what Bonnie was saying, I think this sense of identity being co-constructed in our language practices all the time, that's true for all of us, right? I mean, for those of us who are only exposed to one language throughout our early childhood and generally engage in one language, one named language, one culturally constructed language, just as much as for those of us who grew up with 4 languages and are able to engage across 4 different languages in varied contexts. We use language as a tool, not just to communicate with others, but to position ourselves in the world with relation to others. So this idea of translanguaging is really relevant here, I think, and is often confused. So I think I'll start with a definition, right? Translanguaging, the way I understand it, is theory, is practice, and is pedagogy. And translanguaging theoretically is the idea. It's just thinking about bilinguals in a different way from the bilingual's point of view, instead of from the language's point of view. And translanguaging is understanding that bilinguals, like all of us, draw across our whole linguistic repertoires to communicate and to construct ourselves as people in the world. and to affiliate with different communities, to disaffiliate, to engage in learning, to engage in new language practices as we gain new understandings and grow. So translanguaging as practice, or for teachers as pedagogy, really, translanguaging as pedagogy is the idea that we as teachers can leverage translanguaging in the classroom to understand kids as multilingual learners, as drawing on their whole linguistic repertoire for learning, for thinking, for cognitive work, for learning new language practices, for learning math, for learning science, for learning across the content areas, and for learning to be with others. That language is our tool for being in the world. And languages are our tool if we are multilinguals. And I think I saw somebody in the chat point out that translanguaging can be a research method as well. That's absolutely true. This idea that theoretically we think about bilinguals from the internal point of view can support researchers across the board to think about bilingualism in new ways. So I think, and the last thing I guess that I want to add to that is that I know we're not yet talking about power, but power is central to the idea of translanguaging, because thinking about languaging practices from the multilingual person's point of view means supporting the idea that all language practices communicate and construct identities in the world in equal measure or equitably. So there isn't a superior language practice that we all need to attain in order to gain entrance into the right way of talking, right? Linguists have stood by this for a long time, but teachers and learners, we in classrooms, it's a very hard thing to kind of break out of this idea that there's one standard, one ideal that we all have to achieve, and instead consider our kids to be our teachers, that their languaging supports their thinking, and that our job is to understand where they come from, who they are, and support them building from there into the world. I guess that's a start. I know we'll get back around to it.
That's a start. Thank you so very much. That's more than a start, I think. Andrea, I'd like to invite you into the conversation now from your perspective and from the research that you've done. You know, where do you stand on thinking about language and identity as interconnected systems?
Yeah, so that's an interesting question. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, perfect.
Yeah, okay, I just wanted to make sure. I live in a space where settler colonial language planning has been fairly successful. So it was a place settled by primarily European settlers, and that has to do with lots of reasons. You know, it was kind of orchestrated. And most of those original settlers who joined Indigenous peoples who were there were multilingual. They were from lots of different places, but the provincial and federal governments worked really hard to produce linguistic homogeneity, to successfully create English monolingual speakers. And we sort of live with that today. And it's like the water we swim in, and it's hard to notice it. So when I think about identity and the way that is constructed, I think about the creativity of some individuals when they're trying to assert a different identity rather than English monolingualism, the way that people pepper their languages into conversation. I also think about things like the languages we see in print around us, which in the place where I live are overwhelmingly English. And so then that sends a message to students and teachers and everyone living there about how to conform. You know, linguistic conformity is something I think about. And so I think that there is a lot of noticing that has to go on to sort of understand that the way who we are through our language is constantly negotiated. And sometimes it takes really lots of effort to go against that grain of conforming to, at least in my context, Anglo-normativity.
Thank you. I think you've teed up beautifully here for Sam in thinking about identity practices and who gets to make some choices. So Sam, talk to us about your research and where you see intersections of identity and language in your work.
Well, thanks again for the privilege to be here. I see it as an opportunity to learn quite a bit from some well-renowned and esteemed folks in research areas that I'm unfamiliar with, but am definitely borrowing to infuse into my own work. I'd love to start with that. Secondly, I can share a little bit about my own positionality in terms of how I show up in the work that I do engage in. So I see myself as Black, male, and cisgender. There's a spirituality component. Ethnically and culturally speaking, I see myself as an African American. It took me a long time to get to that point. I felt like the term African American wasn't something that I was able to choose, but that was something that was sort of placed on me. And I had a hard time coming to terms with that as a student in school. And then eventually, when I was pursuing a master's degree and maybe more so a PhD, I kind of got to the point where I felt like I could choose in that way. So as we continue this conversation, I think about the students, like who do they get to choose how they see themselves in these spaces, in educational spaces? Who puts that on them? And then I think about things like how the terminologies change. So a young student may come from El Salvador and teachers may refer to them as Latinx. And they may say, well, what do you mean by that? I don't even know how to enunciate that in my own language. And what does that mean? The goal was to be inclusive in some ways, right? That's what we do. Policy makers do those things. But at the same time, I don't think we have enough student voice involved at the table to really open it up so that we no longer just keep perpetuating these spaces that in my mind are oppressive when folks don't get to articulate themselves and how they see themselves in the work. And not to ramble too much, but I think about if you were to ask a student, how do you identify? And then it might be, well, what do you mean in terms of what? And where are we going? Is it race? Is it gender? And then if they're talking to an adult, might that conversation be different with their peers? And do their peers even use that same framework? And oftentimes the data and the research and the theory and reality don't match. And that's not something that I came up with on my own. That's something that I got from Bonnie Norton. And it really resonates with me as we continue this conversation.
Sam, thank you for leading us into some of the complexity of this and some of the nuances here. So, it is a really complex space because identity is not unitary. As you say, people have these multiple nuanced identities. I want to bring more, we've touched on some of the way that power crosses over this power to choose your own identity and who can and who may get see pushback if they try to exercise that agency and choice. And I want to dig a little bit deeper into this and thinking about whether there are some individuals who more easily are able to negotiate their socially preferred identity. Are there some individuals who are more likely to have challenges or receive social pushback? Sam, I want you to lead us off on this question. And again, and I love for you to help us think about this in relation to the social systems of education. Who is it that students are seeing reflected or not reflected as it might be in educational staff? And how does that impact on students' feeling of belonging and feeling welcomed in your view?
Yeah, I appreciate that question. In some ways, I'll try to answer it both again personally. I can't separate some of my own personal experiences and then reflect a little bit on the work in one particular book we wrote. And so personally, I didn't realize this until I got a little bit older, but on a basic level, when my mom would take me to a school district or a school environment to register me, what was that like when we were going in there? And why was there anxiety that I was experiencing through my mom when we would go into these spaces? And she fought and advocated really hard for us. And over time, I realized that it was as if the environment wasn't necessarily welcoming. Now, why was it not welcoming for her? It seems to me schools should be welcoming places. As I got older and dug a little deeper, I realized she went to school in Mississippi initially and then in Memphis, Tennessee. And so if you go and look at the history, there was a lot of things going on at the time in which she went, segregation, desegregation, and all of these different things. that still lingers. And indirectly, she passed that down to me. So do I see myself in that, just the initial entrance of the school? And then when I'm in the classroom, do I see myself represented? And if not, do I see others like me potentially? And just because I don't see other folks who might identify as Black or African American, might I, what are other people thinking about me when they see me? And it's not just coming from the educational environment, it's stemming from the other cultural aspects, society, and so on and so forth. And it really truly makes a big impact. So the work we discovered was that if in fact parents had negative experiences in school when they were being brought up, they will carry that baggage. They will be anxious. They might not go and participate in certain things. Or if you go to a PTA meeting, they might sit on the outskirts. Again, who's responsible for acknowledging that really that occurred for some folks, not just African Americans, right? Many of the people that we're including here in this discussion. And how do we help? How does the system help create a space so that we can be welcome in there, and not just welcome to be divergent from, but infused, our voices to be heard, our language, our culture, things that folks maybe haven't learned, let me bring it to the table and we infuse that into the work. So I'll stop there.
Yeah, thank you. And I'm reflecting on that and thinking about sort of centering diversity and allowing everyone to both be welcomed, but then to be welcomer, because they belong so much in that space. They get to take that role of being the welcomer also. Deb, I want to turn to you now. I want you to help us think through the way that language has become an important social classification. And I'd love you also to unpack a little bit. There was a term you used earlier. You talked about named languages, and I wonder if you could unpack that for the audience. Talk a little bit about what that means and how it intersects with identity identity, categories, and power.
Sure. I also want to echo what you said about not just being welcomed, but being the welcomer. I really love the way you phrased that. I think that actually that's a super important point. There's a way in which we who live in schools and institutions who kind of own those spaces need to let go a little bit of that ownership, need to kind of come up with ways to step back, quiet ourselves, and become listeners to the communities and to the kids who are so often excluded and marginalized from these institutions. We're representatives of the institutions, and our positionality that way really matters. And I think it's powerful for a teacher or a leader to become a real listener, a critical, authentic listener, to allow themselves to become a learner, to move into a space of being a little uncomfortable sometimes, right? And letting communities, letting kids who may feel excluded from a school tell us of that and tell us why, and let them give us some of the answers to how to support them to become welcomed there. Language is just the world we live in. I think Andrea said it earlier, that's we're like fish swimming in it all the time, right? So there's just the way that language can serve as a tool for us to become those critical listeners, to really step back and be a part of allyship, of I think co-conspiratorship is even a stronger word that Tina Love uses that I like, where we're actually sort of trying our best to allow marginalized communities to take the reins and become a part of our community, the solution, right? So this is true for not just multilingual learners, but for all learners who might come into school feeling as though they don't belong to the dominant community. Social class matters in that picture, gender, race, and I think I'll step into it with race for a minute, because I think, Sam, you were bringing this point up really well. Race and language co-construct one another, and our sense of who someone is often governed by when we hear them talk, And on the contrary, on the other side of it, sometimes we even draw conclusions about people before they even open their mouth about how they should talk or what they should say. In our society, Spanish holds this particular position. It's a colonial language, and yet it's also a subordinate language in particularly in the Southwest. But in our hierarchical view of languages in the U.S., we think of Spanish speakers as racialized, as marginalized folks, and that's a unique positioning, right? A lot of students in our schools, maybe they may identify as Latino, Latina, or Latinx, or Chicana, Chicano, or however they identify, but not necessarily as Spanish speakers. And yet that is overlaid on them as a piece of their identity, whether they want it or not, a lot of the time, right? So race and language are so intertwined as to be sometimes inextricable. Jonathan Rosa's work, he's at Stanford, really, I think, gets at this deeply. And so you wanted me to clarify, Kira, about named languages.
Yes.
That's just the idea that Spanish, that we can talk about Spanish, we can talk about English, we can talk about German or Kiowa or Cree. We can talk about languages as things, as entities outside of the speakers who use them, because they're socially constructed things, right? And they are outside in that sense, but they are socially constructed, so we name them as such. And a bilingual person who grows up with multiple languages in their world intertwined can speak with a monolingual speaker of many of the different named languages they use, but at the same time, they don't have to separate the languages in their own thinking. They will think across their whole repertoires when they're making sense of the world. So to honor the perspectives of bilingual people, I often will refer to languages as named languages to kind of signal that they are, that we think of them as separate from a person, but a person may not think of them as separate in themselves, depending on their identities and their languages. I don't know if that makes sense.
It's a perspective I very much appreciate as a speaker of multiple diverse Englishes. So English is not a unitary thing. Yeah. Sam,
right.
were you gonna add a comment there?
No, not at all. I just appreciate the acknowledgement of that piece of the puzzle, that even within English, the English language, there's so much variation, and we make those assumptions that they all should be the same. So that was it.
There's also a comment in the chat that I actually responded to because I loved it. Somebody pointed out that multiple modalities matter too. So we all use gesture. I've been using it a lot. We use tonality, we use facial expression, and these are aspects of our communicative practice that also shape our identities and that matter in teaching and learning. Teachers leverage all kinds of communicative practices beyond languages when teaching multilingual learners who are learning new language practices. It's really important to acknowledge that, particularly in the participants chat comment, particularly for students whose spoken language may be limited for whatever physical or intellectual reasons.
Absolutely. And as I think about multimodality, I always think, this new modality that we live in Zoom, where we have multiple channels of language going on at the same time. Andrea, I'd like to open up the floor to you. Would you go ahead and comment, now to sort of inject, and you did comment quite a lot about power in what you told us before, but thinking about sort of who has power and who does not necessarily have the same easy access to power in ways that people negotiate that. What have you found in your research there?
Yeah, so I often use that phrase, language as proxy for race, language as proxy for gender. And I also think I'm increasingly thinking about the idea of land and the way that land is connected to opportunities. And in the context where I live, the conversation around land back is very significant. Land was something that brought European settlers to the place where I live. land is why European settlers excluded others from coming. European settlers did not honor agreements and took land. And it continues to affect the material experiences of people in everyday ways, up to now. It's not something in the past. So, issues around indigeneity, and those things are very connected to language and land. There's a relationship between those things that, I think they're probably at some point they were there for settlers in different ways as well, but not in the same way now in contemporary times. And I'm also thinking about the ways that indigeneity is being almost commodified in some ways for settlers. It's something that I don't know if it's the same story in the United States, but in Canada, there's been this kind of pattern over the last 10 or 20 years around people conduct, I guess we would call it identity fraud, people trying to take on different identities that they think will benefit them. And that is happening in university settings quite a bit. And sometimes language is something that people learn. Indigenous languages, non-Indigenous people will learn them. And sometimes that's leveraged as a way to perform a particular identity. So I think that there is a struggle around identity and language that's quite interesting. And in my context where it's not a conversation of strictly white settlers and Indigenous folks, but it's been that kind of imbalance in power for, since this place that we currently call Canada, since it became a thing. And so, yeah, when I think about power right now, what I'm thinking about a lot is identity, Indigenous, non-Indigenous, settler, connections to land, who gets to make decisions about schools and which languages will be taught in schools. And in my context, Indigenous, non-Indigenous continues to be quite significant. Mm-hmm.
I'm reminded of a term that I'm reaching a little bit farther into my an English variety that's not mine, but there's a term that I've heard, swagger jacking, which is stealing the identity, appropriating language identities from other cultural groups is the way that I have heard that term. Yeah. It sounds like a similar.
Yeah, somebody here in the chat was using the term race shifting, which is a word that Daryl LaRue, he's a sociologist writing from Canada. He uses that term. Yeah, someone else is using pretendian. That's another term that's been used. Yeah,
I see performative LARPing as well. Yeah, so
that's good.
Yeah, looks like folks have a variety of ways of noticing and naming that practice. So Bonnie, I'd like you to take us back to that big picture that you started off with, and you've talked about sort of the locuses of power at the macro, meso, and micro levels. And can you kind of help us with sort of the theoretical big picture framework about how you think about power when it's injected into this nexus of language and identity?
Well, interestingly, I'm not going to talk theory right now. This conversation does raise a very important point for me as an educator and a teacher, which is that power is not always negative. Sometimes we tend to think of as power as destructive. And I guess I've always believed that we need to harness power in positive ways and to recognize the source of that power. So that, for example, as teachers, I've always been amazed to see how teachers use their power in classrooms, despite what policymakers say, despite what, some of the theories might be. Teachers have their own power and exercise that often in the best interests of their students. How can we use power positively to bring about change? Or what resources we have, the privileges that we have, for example, to be at universities, to have resources that we can share with others. How can we use those resources well? That's always for me such a challenge, that we're privileged to have so much, then the challenge is how do we use that? And that's the kind of power that I think is particularly important when one thinks educationally. But if we think theoretically, I've always been interested in the work of Foucault, who talks a great deal about power, but he talks about what he calls the capillaries of power. So while we do, think often of power globally and inequities in the world, nationally, there are obviously lots of inequities within and across nations and within communities. But I've been intrigued by almost the invisible realization of power, where we see a person turning their back or lowering their eyes or shrugging or simply not paying attention. These are the capillaries of power, where a statement is made and totally ignored. And I think this is where teachers can make a big difference, because I think teachers need to be observant and vigilant about what not only what is said, but what is not said, and what is performed and what is not performed. And I think that, Foucault's notion of the capillaries of power can help us do that.
Thank you, Bonnie. So that is a beautiful segue to thinking about practical questions around language, power, and identity, and how these insights that you've all shared with us filter into classrooms. How do these kinds of understandings that you are all bringing about language, power, and identity, how do they impact good educational practice? What does that look like in classrooms, and what does it look like also, Bonnie, at the larger scale? What does it look like at the systems level? Bonnie, do you want to talk a little bit about that from your perspective?
Well, one of the things that excites me is the way in which we can draw on technology, to shift relations of power. I belong, one of this morning, I wasn't able to make it, but Sinfrey McConey at Penn State has organized a stunning global forum where he brings together people, across the world to discuss issues of decolonization, Southern epistemologies, and so forth. And I'm very excited by the ways in which technology enables us to cross borders, which is not to say that, of course, we do appreciate that there are inequities, of course, with regard to access to technology. But at the same time, I think technology enables us to reach people in very unique ways and to shift relations of power, especially when it comes to, access to information, access to resources. And that it goes back to the original point I was making. How can we then use the resources that we have, not only to connect with people we already know, but many other people out there who do need access to social networks and other relations of power.
Thank you. I'm going to turn to you, Deb, to share your insights on educational practice, both at the classroom and systems level, if you would.
So I'm going to put it at multiple levels, actually, because while Bonnie was speaking, I was very excited to hear this idea the teacher has a great deal of power in the classroom. At the same time that's absolutely true, it might be really hard for some of the teachers in this room, in this webinar, to hear right now, because it's a very hard time for teachers. And I think I just want to acknowledge that publicly, that teachers feel a lot of power coming down upon them in this moment, different kinds of power at the macro level, power of policies that are silencing and selecting books and curriculum for us, especially in the United States. This has become a huge thing right now. The silencing of having high stakes standardized testing as a regime that we need to address, at the same time that we are trying to navigate, supporting multilingual students, supporting all students to engage across curriculum, engage in new language. This is like it's a tough space to be in, right there in the middle. And I think it can be really empowering to think about just what Bonnie was saying. The very act of shrugging or turning one's back or choosing to listen to a particular kid in a particular moment is power. That's powerful. So, you know, becoming aware of the dynamics of power that exist already in our classrooms can support us to make the choices that will open up spaces for kids. If we know that the different language practices going on in our classroom have hierarchical relationships outside of our classroom, and that world beyond, in our school, in our community, in our country, in our culture, then you know, becoming aware of all those multiple layers can help us make the choice to support the voice of the refugee child to share their experience in a moment that matters, and to support the translanguaging practice, the bilingual languaging, the being bilingual of a kid who doesn't say it in a proper standard English or Spanish or you know, standard language, but shares their experiences to echo that and to amplify it in the classroom and build on it. Those moments matter. So you can, I think, take faith in that as teachers. I mean, I know I hear from my students who are generally teachers in schools here in Colorado, how stressful things can be and how little agency sometimes teachers feel like they have, at least in K-12, but actually across the board now. And I think moments like this matter. Those micro moments are the ways that we can find the spaces, these implementational spaces where policy can be leveraged for justice, for kids, for learning.
Deb seconded with that recognition of teachers there as well. I just, anyone on this call that's a classroom teacher has so much respect from all of us here. I want to turn to Sam now and think a little bit more about that point that Deb raised about those assets that students bring to the classroom. So can you talk about, you know, when students' assets are recognized, what does that look like for kids?
Yeah, I think it's hard to answer that question right away because of all the things that are on the table, right? This hashtag, I think one of the viewers put in there about power doesn't need to be always negative. That was insightful to me. And then hearing you speak, Deb, reminding us of, again, it need not be negative, but who's yielding the power at the table. And if there's not representation, then it can be narrowly focused. And when we try to, and then take that and link it to the teacher, yeah, teachers do some wonderful things for their kids and call it teacher agency, human agency, and building on the strengths of their students. But what sort of resistance do they get when they engage in that type of work? Is it supported by others, or is it looked down upon? Or what about the resistance from policymakers or other family members who say, why are you, you know, building up or creating an equitable space for these folks over here? What about my children? So as I lead into your question, I think about research in a lot of ways. Who created that research? Ideally, it will be co-constructed, but we're not there yet because I haven't seen the voice of the students infused in the policies, at least in the US. And that's a broad statement, but that's where I am and I'm looking for that. And then I have personal story. I recall being a PhD student, but still a school counselor. So I was a school counselor for 10 years and really well versed in the work, I thought, and felt like I could make a contribution to all kids, being a male in the space and being open to queer identities. I would often get asked to run the LGBTQ club. Why is that? I'm not really sure, but it really resonated with me that I must have been sharing something to allow people to feel a connection there. And I recall vividly working with a group of 5th grade African-American boys. I don't recall how they would identify themselves. 4 of them were from, you know, the local area. They were African-American, and 2 were from Ghana. And I came in and was ready to engage in a conversation. And they were going in this wealthy, they were attending school in this wealthy public school district. And I came in with the research and said, hey, I'm here to help you all. I want to help you understand that you're experiencing an achievement gap and you're currently struggling. And they were literally looking at me like, well, where are you going with that? What are you talking about? We have no idea where you're going with that. And it now, as I reflect, it just reminds me of, I came from the institution, the academy, with this knowledge, and I was trying to infuse it in the classroom. And I even identify with these youngsters, and it was oppressive. So that power that I had in that space was used, in a negative way, but it was very unintentional. And might I learn from that? So the strengths that we're looking for, the assets, it's like, again, the indigenous examples you gave, Andrea, I think about, what if folks were colonized, and this is very risky, but in that colonization, they said to the people, we already know you know how to solve problems, so we're not going to put the king's math, the way you solve math, over here in this country on the students, but you tell us how you solve problems, and we infuse that into the work. And I don't see that happening even in this day and age. And so we have to get away from just only seeing it in such a narrowly focused way, but creating space for many people to be at the table, much more representation, in order to ensure that all voices are heard and we disrupt, interrogate, examine, reimagine what it can really look like in this season, because the demographics of the teachers and the educators who are educating the teachers in the US, they don't match the public school students. But we continue, in my experience, using the same pedagogy and the same, research to cultivate what good teaching looks like. And we're moving forward, but I don't think at the same pace in which the demographics are changing.
Thank you, Sam, for sharing that. I'd like to then turn to Andrea. As you think about classroom, school systems, and good practice, what do you see working? What do you see that needs more work?
Sure, I can get to that right away. Deb, did you have something that you wanted to say? I saw your finger go up.
Yeah, I was just going to put an idea, a name to what Sam is saying, this idea of funds of knowledge. I think speaking of community funds of knowledge can give us language. Language is so important for naming the world, right? And then when we can name it, we can change it. Luis Moll at the University of Arizona a generation ago began to think about going as a researcher to communities to learn about communities, and take teachers doing that work, right? And taking what they learn about community knowledge, community ways of doing and being in the world, the expertise of the adults in a child's world, and making curriculum around that. So whether it's from expertise in the adults world, or Sam, as you're saying, kids themselves, the funds of knowledge that communities and kids bring into schools can be used to build from. And if we build into schools from there, then we're addressing kids' own investments in school. Andrea, go ahead. I just wanted to make sure that word was there. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's great. So things that I might think, like, sorry, Kira, was it?
Yeah, let me reorient you in terms of connecting our discussion, Andrea, to educational practice.
Yeah,
in K through 12 schools.
Yeah, so I'll just start by echoing a little bit some of the things that Deb said about agency. When I think about teacher choices in the classroom, some of it is so limited. Does the teacher have power? I don't know. The Education Act says certain things about the number of hours of instruction you can do in languages. The school board trustees make decisions about where resources are allocated. Does a teacher have agency? I don't know. I think the teacher is in the classroom, and a lot of things have been decided already. But I do sometimes, I use this word, and I often, when I'm working with pre-service teachers in Canada, I use this word subversive. I encourage them to find ways to be subversive if they feel like they need to do something that maybe is not, has not been decided by the Ministry of Education, or and what I mean by that is maybe the school board or the ministry has made decisions about curriculum, and of course you have to follow curriculum. But are there ways that you can massage curriculum so that it looks like something that recognizes both the knowledge, but the ways of doing that children and students bring with them into the classroom? And like there are some things in Canada, we have a bit of a different system. We don't have quite the same level of bilingual education models going on in schools. We tend to have, each province will have French and English immersion, French immersion in English speaking context. In Quebec, you don't really have the equivalent. But even that is sometimes restricted. There's an idea that, and this is a weird idea when you think about it, but there's an idea that French immersion is for English speaking students who already speak English. And so I'm fortunate enough to be working with a PhD student right now who's thinking about the ways that society can sort of shift to understand that French immersion isn't a place just for people who speak English. You don't have to be a speaker of English in order to go into French immersion. So when we're thinking about something like an assets-based approach, if somebody is already multilingual and has learned other languages, why wouldn't you put them in a context where they would be on the same playing field of all the other students learning French? Why wouldn't you make French immersion students be a really multilingual space? And yet there's still this sort of idea that English is the baseline. And so if you don't have your English in place, then you can't learn the other languages. And so I think about those sort of subversive ways that people who take the intake forms can make decisions about who goes where. Like, do you encourage that family to choose French immersion, even though it might not be where you expect that child to be? Maybe you think they should go work on their English, but English is like COVID. You'll catch it, right? Like it's we don't have to worry too much about people not developing English in a context like the United States or Canada, at least in my experience. So I'll stop there. I'm glad you liked my sort of inappropriate joke. Very good. I'll stop.
We get to, well, like Sam said earlier, he was taking risks. Take some risks in these spaces. Absolutely. Well, I want to keep going to even more concrete classroom practice. Bonnie, I know you have some online resources that really sort of drill down into what this might look like in practice, and I'd like to invite you to share those with us.
Well, thank you so much, Kira, and thank you for this amazing conversation with panelists. I want to just pick up on the distinction we sometimes make between theory and practice. We talk about theory and then we say, well, where's the practice? I see, in fact, these as integrally related. What we do in practice often has a theoretical framework and a theoretical logic. And I hope to be able to demonstrate this, in these resources. But I'm going to pick up also on what Sam was saying about how do we make schools welcoming to diverse learners, and picking up on Deb's point on how do we appreciate the funds of knowledge that students have. And when I worked with them, I worked on the African Storybook with colleagues in South Africa, and we have repurposed a lot of this work at the University of British Columbia into what is called the Global Storybooks Project. And I do that because I know Carolyn Benson had a little comment earlier about give us some actual practical advice on what to do or activities. And I feel that, I agree very much that we need to then look at what are the implications for practice and to what extent is practice theoretical. So I'm going to share with you, I'll be very brief, the Global Storybooks Project and the site for English learners. And also I'm going to look at Washington, DC, Kara, just because I thought, well, to acknowledge where you're at. So I'm going to share screen. I hope this will come up here.
And I'll drop the link in chat for folks as well for this resource.
So I'm just going to, let's see if I can just pull this off here. So here we have the Global Storybooks Portal. It's a free multilingual literary resource for children. I'm just trying to kind of pull this away here so that I can actually see you. Let's see here. I can take this up here. Okay. That is a free open educational resource that promotes literacy and language learning in homes, schools, and communities. It's part of the Global Storybooks Project. It makes 40 stories from the African Storybook available with text and audio. And here we have Storybooks Brazil in the most widely spoken languages of Brazil. But let me take you back to the Storybooks Project. And I'm going to show you the different sites that we have, ranging from Afghanistan, Bangladesh, Brazil, Florida, Greece. We've got an indigenous storybook site. We've got, we just created a Storybooks Ukraine site as well. There we have Storybooks Ukraine. I'm going to take you to the Washington, D.C. site, but let me just show you the English site for learners of English. Here you can change languages. We've talked about, often teachers struggle and say, we'd like to support the different languages that are spoken in our classrooms, but we don't have the resources, we don't know the languages. And here we have, for learners of English, we have 26 languages that are available in both print and audio. And we've taken 40 stories from the African Storybook, beautifully illustrated, and stories that would be appropriate for diverse learners, for children and youth, and also available in 5 different levels. And let me just take you to the Washington, D.C. site, just to show you how one would actually utilize the audio. I'm going to pick it up over here. And here we see, let's take you to perhaps one of the stories, which is Andiswe Soccer Star. And I'm going to change that to Spanish, since I know Spanish is broadly spoken in the US and North America. So what we see here is, for those, here we have a story that's in both English and Spanish and many other languages. And for those who don't speak Spanish, I'll just show you what the English version is. Andiswe watched the boys play soccer. She wished to join them. She wanted to be able to practice with them, but in fact was told that really only boys play soccer. But let's have a look. We've also got it in Spanish.
Andiswe miraba a los chicos jugar fútbol. Ella deseaba ser parte del equipo. Le preguntó al entrenador si podía entrenar con ellos.
We can just do that one more time to show you here that how you can operate that.
El entrenador puso sus manos en la cintura y le respondió: en esta escuela, solo los chicos pueden jugar fútbol.
Now, what's also wonderful are the download options that we have available. And I'm going to move this over here, so that here you have the download options, so that you can actually download these and print them out without free. These are freely available, and you can print them out in monolingual format. You can print them out in wordless format, and kids can write their own stories. You can print it out in imageless format, and kids can copy and create their own images. And I'll just show you the landscape version here, because stories then would be available. You could print them out, and these will be available in 2 languages. And I noticed in the chat that a number of people were talking about dual language systems as being very helpful to learners. So we've got over 70 languages that are available on the English Learner site, and we've got many of those languages available also in print and audio. So I'm going to just stop there and just hope that people will have fun exploring these sites and seeing ways in which you can not only work with named languages, but also do a lot of translanguaging between languages that are familiar to children and languages that they wish to learn. Thank you.
Thank you, Bonnie, for sharing those with us. And those are so beautifully done. And those illustrations are so welcoming to kids. And just, I think sometimes the space of seeing your own language in a high prestige space like a school on a website is really important for kids as well. Well, I am gonna just do a general to all our panelists. If there's anyone else who has resources that you would like to just mention to the group or share with them, let me open that up to all of you if you would like to share. Deb, your hand is up.
Although that is a really hard act to follow, that is an astounding resource, really wonderful stuff. This is very different stuff, targeted towards teachers. I did not create these materials. I give full credit to the team at CUNY, the New York State Initiative for Emergent Bilinguals. I just put the link in the chat. The CUNY NYSIB website has teaching resources, lesson plans, videos engaging with teachers. Also, lots of a video library of different panels and researchers presenting about and the translanguaging guides. So if you were interested in some of what I was saying about translanguaging pedagogies in particular and how to leverage multilingual learners' linguistic repertoires across the curriculum in the classrooms, I think the CUNY NYSIB website is a good place to explore, to start with. And as far as stories, I have been working with some colleagues on a book that's not out yet, but I'd like to drop the link to the book's site also in the chat here, full of stories of educators, leaders, policymakers, teachers, family community organizers, and teacher educators sharing their stories of working towards a critically conscious practice in dual language settings. And that's particularly about dual language settings, but about working with bilingual and multilingual learners in those settings and centering those. So both those resources hopefully will be useful to you. The book will be coming out in the new year, but I think it'd be a good tool for teachers or school leaders to use for professional development. Because we need examples. If we're going to do it, we got to know what it looks like, right? So if we really want to support asset-based pedagogies and perspectives about multilingual learners, it's good to have some examples of what that might look like. Yeah, sorry, the book title is kind of in the link there. It's Critical Consciousness in Dual Language Bilingual Education, Case Studies of Policy and Practice.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Sam, Andrea, anything, or drop them in the chat if you want to add in?
Not at all, but I want to co-sign on both Bonnie's work. We saw that earlier, and I did go and peruse Deb Palmer's book as well. It's the book you're referring to, Deb's not out yet, right? But we're able to see a preview of the chapters. And again, it's material that I could see easily infused into the counselor education world. So it's just fascinating.
At some point I muted myself. I'm not sure why. Agreed. I would just say, I would agree with Sam. I don't have anything to share, but I think that the resources we've seen here today are wonderful. Yeah.
I'm also going to put in a plug. I'm a University of Hawaii graduate, and there's an ethnomathematics program at the University of Hawaii. Sam, the way that you were talking earlier about thinking about students' own ways of doing things, it reminded me of it. So I'm plugging that in the chat there to share with folks. I want to turn now to some questions from our audience, and folks, do please feel free to continue to put questions into the Q&A or the chat box. There's a couple of questions that folks have asked about, thinking about language and power and supporting students in accessing linguistic identities that have power that go along with them. So this person asks, how do we translate this work into supporting students in gaining greater fluency in the language they are studying? For example, gaining greater fluency in English, and also someone asked, I think, a very similar kind of question about folks who recognize that there may be prejudice against the way that their name sounds. And so this person puts it this way: sometimes we have to choose between success and loyalty, thinking about your identification with a minoritized identity. So, thinking about that sort of identification with a minoritized identity and ways in which support for teachers navigate that challenge in supporting students' access to the languages of power. Could you, how have you seen that play out, and what are some of the tensions there?
Perhaps I could jump in there, Kira, because this is something that's very close to my heart. The one thing that I think teachers should strive to do as much as possible is try to determine the particular strengths of a given student, from a diverse, multicultural, multilingual backgrounds, so that even though the student may not, for example, speak English, they could be a great artist, they could be a wonderful musician, they could be great at soccer. And so what the teacher can do, and it's all about, of course, the teacher using power innovatively, is how do you create situations in which the alternative identities of that student becomes visible to the peers. So rather than a student being seen as an ESL student, the question is, can that student be seen as a musician, a great soccer player? And can you create opportunities, whether it's encouraging kids to go and play sport, or whether to organize an evening of artistic endeavors in your school? Because what you're wanting to do is to shift the way that child is seen in relation to others. That you want that child to be seen as having multiple identities. They are perhaps an English language learner, but at the same time, they're fantastic at chess and they're fabulous at soccer. And then children start seeing kids in more nuanced ways. You come to my party, or you join my football team. And then what you're doing is that you're opening up possibilities for social interaction. And I know Sandy McKay many years wrote a wonderful article in the Harvard Educational Review around precisely this issue of how do you encourage and make available opportunities for language learners to be seen as having multiple identities and multiple abilities, in the target language community. So just a plug there for that work. Thank you.
Can I follow up on that? Because absolutely, that's fantastic. And I see teachers struggle with this tension space all the time. This tension between acknowledging that power differentials between languages, cultures, races, and so on are unjust, and that all children should be able to enter learning spaces as who they are and not have to adapt who they are to be whatever the dominant society is trying to form them to be. And at the same time, acknowledging that it's part of our job as representatives of the hegemonic schooling system to support kids to get the tools to access the language and culture of power. And if we abdicate that responsibility, we do a disservice to individual kids as they're trying to navigate the halls of power. So I think it's important to just acknowledge that both those things are true at the same time. That it is true that kids need access. They need to learn to mush fake, as Jim G might say. They need to understand the ways that power operates from a critical perspective. They need to know those things so they can navigate through it for themselves and their communities and their families and their friends, right? And those things shouldn't be standing in our kids' ways, and we constantly have to be advocates to change systems, to push against whiteness and hegemonic structures. So those can both be true at once, and to just keep telling ourselves we're adults, we can live with contradiction.
I would add then when you say that, and this is not a specific thing to do, you know, in terms of the pedagogy, but might we remove barriers from students having to do double the work? That's terminology in this field. And in my mind, it's like multiple intelligences. So I have my daughter, she's in an advanced math class. She has to go into the class and navigate this idea that she doesn't belong there. So there's some anxiety or oppression that's associated with that, and also access the curriculum. So as I think about most of the students we're talking about here, might we remove that and say, you're welcome, you're brilliant, you have skills and talents and gifts that maybe we're not talking about in the curriculum, but I give you the benefit of the doubt that you have them. And as a result, allow the students to show up and function and engage in that material in their own ways. That resonated with me, Deb. I'm not sure if my follow-up applies, but that definitely spoke to me.
I think you kind of resolved the tension a bit there, what I was talking about.
Thinking, yes, thinking of and just the recognition of the brilliance of students is a really important thing to do. Let me turn to another question then. So thinking more on a systems level, and I'm going to just read this question verbatim. What are your thoughts on improving awareness of and responsiveness to language identity power dynamics within our English-centric school and community context? What motivates those who are not already co-conspirators to engage in this work?
So I can talk a little bit about what I've done in classrooms with pre-service teachers, and not everyone is converted to the idea when they walk into class. And one of the things that I've had some success with is trying to get them to see connections between their own lives. And let me just say that I teach in a faculty of education where the majority of students don't look like the children of the public schools they're going to work in. So it's mostly white, English-speaking pre-service teacher candidates. And one of the things that I have them do is think about the ways that language shift is something that's happened in their families. I make them talk to family members who experienced language shift. And oftentimes, starting with those stories, like I think story is one of the most effective ways to teach. And I think we even saw that here today in the panel. When people would start with a story, it grabbed people's attention. So when they care about the stories of people in their own families and they start to make connections between those things and the stories of students that they'll teach and the families that they'll work with, it seems to make them think in ways that I can't necessarily get the same connection when I'm just assigning readings. I assign readings, but I also try to include story. And it's not just stories of their own families, because it shouldn't have to be about your own family for you to care. I bring in speakers to the classroom, and students connect with those. I also do practicum-based learning as well. They go out and work in schools with children who are not first language speakers of English and who are trying to navigate the system. And those I think relationship is another thing that really matters. I would say stories matter, relationships matter. And when they start to develop relationships with the students who will be in their future classrooms, that also seems to trigger something where they think, oh, I better know how to help these people because I am caring about these people. And so I would say that it's sort of something that has been a bit successful in my own settings.
Sam or Bonnie, you want to add in anything sort of to thinking through folks that where do folks that engage with this work in their own classrooms, how do they, where does their motivation come from, and how do we increase that across more teachers?
I have a, oh, Bonnie, you first, please.
No, go ahead, Sam.
Mine's very clear and concise. In the state of Virginia, we need the policymakers to help with that. Teachers are scared to engage in some of this work for fear of either losing their jobs or being ostracized. And for example, critical race theory is being misconstrued as, promoting or brainwashing, or some of those terms that are related to the fear of engaging in race-related conversation versus let's critique the way race was being used in education over the years and find a better way to do it. So that's where I can just jump in. The policymakers, whoever is at the table, have to create space for the folks actually engaging in the work to feel comfortable to do that without being bombarded with the hate mail or parents saying that you're brainwashing our kids or fear of losing their jobs.
And
Sorry, Bonnie.
Sitting that alongside the research that says particularly white families have challenges talking about race, and if white teachers are coming from that space, you're quite right, Sam, you don't get there without the leadership and the policy space. Bonnie, go ahead.
Yeah, I guess I'm tackling this from a slightly different perspective because, and this could be helpful perhaps for older learners in our classrooms, and that is I've talked about people becoming researchers of their communities. As newcomers come into a new society, they often feel very unequal. But if you give them a different identity, the researcher, so to speak, the ethnographer of their new society, you're giving them a different lens through which they can understand the world in which they live, and comment on it, think about it, and bring insights back to a peer group and say, what were your experiences? Did you have this? And then take the opportunity to share both the successes and the challenges that people have had as they've attempted to navigate their new society. So it's about ensuring that people have an identity of power, that of researcher, as they actually enter into their new society and community.
Or even teacher as learner, that we learn. Right. We learn from our students, we all do.
Exactly.
So, position yourself as a learner, and that can certainly help. You engage in listening, you become a listener.
Exactly.
I have a question here about two-way programs in the United States, and specifically about the expansion of two-way programs in recent years. And this question is about the positionality of parents who choose DLI as a bonus for their students' future educational investment. And could individuals who belong to the majority group, who are acquiring a second language in whatever target languages in that program, how do those students develop a sense of bilingual identity? And does that look like the same kind of bilingual identities that emerge out of a minoritized student? This is a really interesting question.
Yeah,
I've been thinking a lot about this lately, so I would actually love to start us off, and I know that Bonnie will jump in after. I think this idea of a bilingual identity doesn't necessarily have to be what folks from a majority community gain from a two-way dual language program, but a program will only serve the needs of the language minoritized community that's present in it if those majoritized folks, those dominant culture and language folks, also engage in critical consciousness or solidarity work while they're in the bilingual space. So they may not need to or want to or in any way gain a bilingual identity themselves, a bicultural identity, or they may, but the important thing is that they engage in solidarity with the community that they are joined with, that they are not just there to extract the language and culture resources from the minoritized language community to gain bilingualism for their own economic or social gains, but rather they're there present to support the minoritized community to create a more just society together.
And if I could just add to that, I agree with you completely, Deb. Absolutely. I'd like to also add that this is an opportunity for people not to see language in essentialized terms. Say that, for example, you're learning Spanish, but there are many different kinds of Spanish in different parts of the world. How can we understand Spanish speakers, in time and place not only in the US context, although that would be obviously important, but on a global context. And I think that's where one starts to see the nuance, whether it's learning English for that matter, many different types of English, Arabic, many different types of Arabic. So I think then you develop what we call language awareness or critical language awareness as we learn about other communities. Not only, of course, the language that they speak, but the print that they use. Often it comes as a surprise to people. Oh my goodness, Mandarin, look at the print. Very different. The script is very different. And I think that we could complement that critical consciousness, Deb, that you're talking about with, in a sense, critical language awareness, which I think is also a wonderful way to move forward educationally.
Thank you all so much. I am going to round us out with one final question to all of the panelists. And I am struck by the way we keep coming back to the notion of story. And so I would love it if you could, and I'm putting you on the spot here, but I would love it if you could just tell a story, an example of students' language in school that you've observed, where you say this really is this is an illustrative story about how a student used their linguistic self to work to show their identity, perhaps to work through some of those challenging power dynamics we've been thinking about. So I would love to just hear, what have you seen kids do with language?
I have a wonderful story, if you don't mind. I'm just going to jump in there. For it. This was research that was actually done on French immersion in Calgary. And students were watching a story called Counting Animals. And so they saw all the animals from Africa. And a young girl from Pakistan said, I'm going to tell you stories about animals from Pakistan. And the teacher said, oh, that's interesting. She said, yes, because I thought I could only talk about bears in Canada, but I see that we can now talk about elephants and lions in classrooms. So I'm going to talk about animals in Pakistan. I just love that. So how utilizing innovative resources then makes learners from other parts of the world see themselves as legitimate speakers and can legitimately discuss, diverse experiences, families, communities, and resources. Thank you.
I have a really different kind of story. In a kindergarten two-way dual language classroom, a young 6-year-old, almost 6-year-old African-American child and a young, I think 6-year-old Latino child interacting around a dramatization they're supposed to do. And the poem they're trying to enact is a well-known poem, which is a bilingual poem. And it is English time. And the Latino child insists on speaking in Spanish. An African-American child, using African-American vernacular, calls over the teacher and says he needs to use English. This is English time. And the teacher comes in and says, how about, can you try Spanish? He's trying to use Spanish because the poem is in Spanish. Can you try? African-American boy says, I am not bilingual. I am not going to try that Spanish. And the Latino child insists and says, no, this is a bilingual poem and I'm using my Spanish, so you need to use yours. And that kind of dynamic that happens every day in a two-way dual language classroom where it is supposedly, what did I say, English time? But kids are bilingual and they do being bilingual all day.
Andrea?
I was going to say your name.
I hit the mute button first. So
yeah.
First.
I don't have any stories that I can tell in beautiful ways like that, but I can say that I've been lucky enough to attend some Indigenous language camps over the last few years. And one of the things that I've noticed in that setting is the way that Indigenous language reclamation, when it's enacted by a child, doesn't just affect the child. When the child speaks in Cree or Soto, it affects the entire community, and there is healing in that performance of Cree language use or Soto language use. So I think the story, and I'm not telling it in a really nice way because we have 1 minute, is that it's not just beneficial to the child in their classroom learning. I think it's something that affects the whole language, the whole family and community, and that's the little nugget of story I would share.
Sam, I'm going to give that minute to you.
What I can share along Andrea's lines are not a story of a student that I've worked with, but being a student myself. My father was in the military, so we traveled a lot. I lived in Germany 6 years. I came to the US as an 8th grader and got accused of not doing my own homework. Sam, this is written so well. Who wrote this for you? Sam, did your parents help you with your homework? And my parents hadn't helped me with my homework since I was in 2nd grade. So I kind of thought that was funny. But by the end of that year, there were 3 different teachers, math, English, and social studies or science, who kept saying these things to me. By the end of that year, they said, one day when you get to the Oprah show, telling you how old I am, right? That we hope to be there and so into you. So I guess the point of the story is try not to make these assumptions, right? Just why was it that I wrote so well? Did they have this image of someone who looked like me that wouldn't write that well or wouldn't do their homework? What's that about? And by the end of that, they were actually my champions. So I knew they had it within them. And the 3 teachers were not all white teachers. There were 2 African-American teachers and 1 white teacher. So the point of the story is give us a chance, give your students a chance. There's brilliance and excellence in all of them. And as Bonnie mentioned, let's find out what that is and draw upon that and make these spaces equitable and inclusive.
Well, that is all we have time for today. Thank you so much to our speakers, Bonnie Norton, Deborah Palmer, Sam Steen, Andrea Sturzuk, for sharing their insights and experience. And thank you to our audience for your questions, your comments, and your enthusiasm. Thank you for showing up around this issue. We encourage you to share what you've learned today with your colleagues. We will be sending a recording of this webinar to you via email. You can also find this event and many more resources that support multilingual learners on our website, www.cal.org. I have also just dropped into the chat a brief survey. We would love to get your feedback about how we did today. It helps us improve our future events. Thank you all so much, and I wish everybody a wonderful weekend.
Thank you.